tippy top. That is the white children who are in their with their biological parents. Now, I'm of the opinion that the non-adopted whites had higher IQs because of their genes, that their higher IQs over the adopted whites was actually a result of the genetic differences between the adopted whites and the non-adopted whites. But that's not really the important point of this study. The important point is talking about the differences between the adopted whites and the blacks and mulattoes. The next point is that mulattoes tend to be intermediate, right? Along with the intermediate mulatto score in the Minnesota Transracial, we can also look at the intermediate mulatto scores in South Africa, and I'm pretty sure I can find more. I know that there are a lot more stuff doing this, showing that mulattoes or mixed-race blacks tend to have much higher IQ scores than pure blacks. And historically, mulattoes have actually been treated worse than pure blacks because mulattoes are the products of race mixing, right? So if you want to go by historical oppression, mulattoes have been treated worse because race mixing is hated by racial nationalists. We can also look at gene amplification. Now, I'm sure that you've noticed that as you've gotten older, you look and act more like your parents, right? Also, when you're younger, you tend to have lighter features than when you get older. There's a lot of people who are blonde as kids, but then they get older, they have darker hair. For example, I'm kind of like that. This is because as you get older, genes will get expressed more. And so the dominant genes start to express more over the recessive genes, which tend to be of lighter features. Also, if you look at a chicken and a human's embryo, you'll see that they look very similar. Okay? It's not until further development that the human baby pulls away from the chicken baby. There was also a study done by Winthrop Kellogg where he raised his son Donald alongside a baby chimpanzee Gua. And the baby human and the baby chimp were actually quite evenly matched in a lot of these little intellectual tests that they were doing at a very young age. But of course we know that, and the test was canceled when Donald started mimicking the behavior of the chimp. And I think because the father was worried that Donald was going to start acting like a chimp or something, so he called off the study at that point. But we know, of course, that as development continues, humans become more intelligent than chimps, and humans begin to pull away from the chimpanzees, right? And this is an example of gene expression, genes becoming more important with age between species. We can also look at males and females. It's not until puberty that males become stronger than females. And finally, after illustrating this principle in obvious examples, is that racial differences in standardized test scores widen with age. Okay? Young whites and young blacks have very similar test scores. At a very young age, whites and blacks in schools tend to be much more evenly matched than later on. So that's evidence of, the differences being genetic, because as genes get more and more expressed through age, the racial IQ gap gets more expressed. Another example of this would be subtest heritability. Some portions of IQ tests are more heritable than others, which is to say the parental score and the child score correlate higher on some subtests than others. For example, math is one of the least heritable subtests and can be taught very easily. While pattern recognition, for example, is much more heritable. Pattern recognition really can't be taught as well, but math can be taught. So the inference is that pattern recognition is something more innate. It's something more in your genes, whereas math is more environmental, i.e. it can be taught. And we all know that some things can be taught and some things are more innate. Well, the racial gaps on the IQ tests are wider on the parts of the test that are more heritable, i.e. the subtests that are more innate. Okay, on the subtests which can be trained and the subtests which are more influenced by environment, the gap is smaller. Okay, this is evidence that genetic differences are the main cause of the racial IQ test gaps, not environmental differences. And then he says, you can't prove that because there's not an equal playing field because blacks and Latinos are trapped in poverty due to history. And you all know that spiel. And this is kind of funny. Because now this person is making two positive claims here. He first started off said that I was making a positive claim without evidence. Now he's making two positive claims here. First, he's saying that the degree of poverty that exists in the U.S. has a significant impact on standardized test scores. I disagree, and I've shown some evidence that suggests this is not the case. But 6 pieces of evidence against this idea that the poverty that exists in the U.S. explains differences in standardized test score. The evidence of this would be the twin studies, the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study, the Milwaukee Voucher Study, the Abecedarian Project, intellectual self-assessment studies, and the Korean-Belgian Adoption Study. Now, we've already talked about the Minnesota Transracial Study and the twin study, so let's start off with the Milwaukee Voucher Study. The Milwaukee Voucher Study showed parity, essentially, between voucher schools and public schools. It showed that students who applied for vouchers and got them did no better than students who applied for vouchers and did not get them. This is evidence that the differences in quality of schools within the U.S. is not important, and that the schools don't produce good students, okay? What's actually happening is that good students tend to go to the same schools, creating the illusion that the school itself has something to do with the student quality when it really doesn't. Okay, then there's the Abecedarian Project. The Abecedarian Project was an extremely early intervention project. It was like Head Start on steroids. They took infants at 6 months, if I recall correctly, and what they had is they had basically professional educators working nonstop to raise these kids' IQs, and these kids were minorities. The idea was to get minorities in there, blacks and Hispanics. Now, what normally happens with these types of programs is that there are gains for these kids when they're very young, right? But these gains don't last later on in their lives, right? And that's what happened with the Abecedarian Project. Now, the Abecedarian Project was quite an extensive intervention. I mean, these are professional educators dealing with these kids. Like, I'd have to go read over the study again, but it was like 4 hours a day when they were really little kids, doing all of these, like every trick in the book to try to like teach kids concept, teach kids like pattern formation, and trying to raise their general intelligence, really. And but anyway, what happened, it's kind of like learning to tie your shoes when you're really young. Let's say you learn how to tie your shoes before everyone else does. Okay. Does this mean that you will then learn calculus better than everyone else later on? No. And that's what kind of happens with these early intervention programs, right? They teach these kids things, and so these kids are actually ahead of everyone else in the class in terms of what they know, because they know the alphabet before everyone else. They know the names of shapes before everyone else. But learning these things, it doesn't increase your base level intelligence, okay? It doesn't increase your innate ability, okay, which is what IQ is designed to measure. It increases your knowledge, but it doesn't increase, for lack of a better term, the engine, the horsepower, the intellectual horsepower. It just increases what you already know. Okay, there was, and the Abecedarian Project, like a lot of people talk about how white families show how the educational environment around white families, white parents teaching their kids things is a cause of white students doing better in school and white kids having higher IQs later on in life. The Abecedarian Project puts the lie to that, right? Because they had these professional educators doing far more than the average white parent does, and the Abecedarian Project ended up having almost zero impact. In fact, there was a quote from someone who worked on the Abecedarian Project that showed that the IQ, that the best determinant for IQ of the students in the Abecedarian Project was the parental IQ. And it had very little to do with whether or not they were involved in the Abecedarian Project or whether or not they were in the control group. There was also a study that followed malnourished North Korean babies into Belgium. That there were these babies in North Korea, and they were malnourished, and then they were sent to Belgium. And so they're malnourished at babyhood. So there's an argument that white parents give their babies better nutrition than black and Hispanic parents, and black and Hispanic parents have more formula or use formula more often, and so their babies don't have the same nutrition. And this study kind of puts the lie to that, because as it turns out, these malnourished babies, once they were fed a proper diet in Belgium, they quickly caught up to and outperformed the white Belgian population. In fact, they performed at the North Asian average, the global average IQ of North Asians, which is about 106, compared to white Europeans, which is about 100. Okay, and so they were slightly above the white European average, despite, for the first, for some of these, it was like the first 3 years of their lives they were malnourished, but they quickly caught up. Right? It's as though they had the genetic code, the DNA, in their brain to say, this is the kind of brain you're going to have, but I don't have the resources now. But as soon as the resources were provided, the genes started to get expressed. Okay? So nutrition was not. It kind of puts the lie to the nutrition arguments. Another thing to look at is that blacks also have a higher self-esteem than whites, but more importantly, they also have a higher intellectual self-assessment, as they view themselves as more intelligent than white people view themselves. So even if you could show that stereotype threat, for example, does have a negative effect when present, I disagree with that, but even if that was true, the fact is that stereotype threat has not been internalized by blacks, according to these intellectual self-assessment surveys. Then you may want to say that the IQ tests are biased. No, they are not. I'll just link to an article talking about IQ test bias. Basically, IQ tests, the predictive validity of IQ tests is the same for blacks as it is for whites. Blacks do just as well on supposedly culture fair IQ tests than cultural. Actually, no, that's not true. Blacks actually do better on the supposedly culture biased IQ tests than on the culture fair tests, and blacks actually do better on the verbal portion of the IQ tests than on the nonverbal portion, right? And of course, the verbal portion is where the bias is supposed to be, right? But of course, blacks actually do better on that. So if anything, that's evidence that IQ tests are biased in favor of blacks a little bit. So the tests are not biased. That's an argument that's not even an argument. It's just a pronouncement that people who don't understand, who haven't read anything about this, make. Okay, so basically we've reasonably ruled out the effect of home environment, of school environment, early educational environment, early nutritional deficiencies, low self-esteem, and test bias. Okay, so I don't know what other possible environmental variables you have. Now, the thing is, you can come up with new environmental arguments all the time, right? You can make up an infinite number of these. But the thing is, evidence points to, and I'm getting really tired, evidence points to genes. Then he says that blacks and Hispanics are poor and have lower IQs, and they get more addicted to drugs because of the stress. And basically he's making kind of like a Malou argument, that they end up getting in kind of a funk. You know, they get poor, the poor causes stress causes the drugs drugs cause more stress, and the drugs cause more poverty, and they all self-reinforce each other. Well, first off, part of this is matter-of-factly not true. Okay, blacks and Hispanics are actually less stressed than whites, and links into articles that make that case. So in terms of stress, they're actually less stressed. Then this guy is talking about poor people doing dumb things, right? He talks about alcohol and drugs and stuff like that. But he hasn't made any causal argument. Yes, poor people are dipshits. That's why they're poor. Right? The dipshittery causes the poorness. And there is scant evidence that the causation flows the other way. Like, we've looked at the twin studies, right? You know, we've looked at the adoption studies, right? We've looked at all this stuff. Okay? If you look at white European immigrants or North Asian immigrants to the U.S., back when those groups were immigrating to the U.S., okay, as a group, those people weren't dipshits. They were poor at